We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 52a. On the previous Daf, the Gemara brought a brisa which discusses the phrase El Mizbach Yisod Ha'ola, which appears a number of times. It's talking about pouring the remainder of the blood to the base of the outer Mizbeach. One of the times it says that pasuk is by the Seir Nasi, by the he-goat of the Nasi, the he-goat that's brought by the king. And the brisa darshan that pasuk is teaching that anytime you have applications of blood, not only by that particular carbon, but anytime there are applications of blood on the outer Mizbeach, the remainder of the blood is poured to the base of the Mizbeach, again, of that outer Mizbeach. And the Gemara explained it has to be that that's what the pasuk is teaching, because if the pasuk was only talking about the Seir Nasi, it would be too obvious, because we've already said that when it comes to the carbon chatos, where the blood is applied inside by the inner Mizbeach, so over there you pour the blood at the base of the outer Mizbeach, so certainly by the Seir Nasi, where the blood is applied on the outer Mizbeach, certainly the remainder is going to be poured to the base of the outer Mizbeach. And the Gemara then said, well, maybe you'll say, no, it's not so obvious, because maybe one might think that deberoi legavoy, that when it comes to those karbanos where the blood is applied to the outer Mizbeach, maybe the remainder is poured by the base of the inner Mizbeach. With the gavoy liberoi, and maybe where you have karbanos where the blood is applied to the inner Mizbeach, so then the remainder of the blood is poured to the base of the outer Mizbeach. Maybe that would be a possibility, and so maybe the pasuk actually is just talking about the seir of the nasi. But the Gemara says, no, you would never think that, because ha'ein lo yisod lepnimi atzmo, as we mentioned in that brisa on the previous daf, there is no yisod, there is no base to the inner mizbeach, so nobody would have thought, you would have never thought such a thing. And so therefore, again, it is clear that what the pasuk is actually teaching, the pasuk is teaching that anytime there are applications of blood to the outer mizbeach, the remainder of the blood is poured to the base of the mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, the brisa said, Oeno ella mizbeach shel ola yeheli yisod. This was a suggestion of the brisa. The brisa said maybe where by the Seir Nasi, where it says this pasuk el yisod mizbach ha'ola, maybe what it really means is that by the mizbeach shel ola yeheli yisod. We'll take a look at the Shinuya Nuschos Girsa, lemizbecha shel ola yehei yisod. For the mizbeach of the ola, there should be a yisod, there should be a base. And what that was referring to is, maybe what the pasuk actually is talking about is not the pouring of the remainder of the blood. Maybe the pasuk is talking about the applications of the blood by the carbanola. There's the application of the blood, and maybe the application of the blood by the carbanola is only done by the parts of the mizbeach where there is a yisod. The yisod did not run around the entirety. It didn't entirely surround the mizbeach. So if there was an area of the mizbeach with no yisod, so that area of the mizbeach, maybe there wouldn't be an application of blood. Maybe that is what the pasuk was referring to. That's what the brisa said, and the brisa then went on to say, and the Gemara here will discuss as well, the brisa went on to say, no, in terms of that halacha, we would have a kal v'chomer. You don't need a pasuk for that. That was the discussion with Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva, and so therefore, again, the pasuk actually is saying that anytime the blood is applied to the outer mizbeach, the remainder is poured to the base of the mizbeach. And so again, that's a quote from the brisa, Eino el mizbeach shalola yeheli yisod. And the Gemara now says to that, Mi ksiv el yisod ha'ola. What kind of suggestion is this, that it means that the applications of the blood are going to be applied by the area where there's a yisod? Does it say el yisod ha'ola? If it said el yisod ha'ola, so then it would be understandable to interpret that way. El yisod mizbach ha'ola ksiv. It's actually written yisod mizbach ha'ola. So why would we ever think that we're talking about these applications of the blood? And Rashi explains, miksiv el yisod ha'ola. Does it say in the pasuk el yisod ha'ola to the base of the ola? El yisod mizbach ha'ola ksiv. It talks about the altar of the ola. And Rashi explains, Bishlami da rashle litein toras shvichas shirayim l'chol domim hachitzonim shapir. I understand if you're saying that we're talking about, again, anytime you pour the remainder of the blood, anytime blood is applied to the outer mizbeach, you have to pour to the base of the mizbeach of the outer mizbeach, again, the remainder. So then ksiv mizbach ha'ola, then I understand. It says mizbach ha'ola, litein toras yisod lemizbeach ha'ola l'chol domim hanizrakim olav, to say there's a law of pouring the remainder to the yisod anytime on the outer mizbeach that there's an application of blood to the outer mizbeach. We can understand the phrase mizbach ha'ola if, again, we learn as we learned in the brisa. But if you're darshaning this for tchilas damim means literally the beginning of the blood. It's talking about the application. If that's being suggested by the brisa, that's what the pasuk is referring to. Su leko l'meimar litein Torah keneged hayesod lemizbach ha'ola l'chol damav. You can no longer say that what the pasuk means is to apply this law, that again, by the application of the blood blood, it has to be keneged hayesod for all bloods of the Mizbeach. It can no longer be universal if we're talking about the applications of the blood. Why? Because the carbon chatos requires application of the blood on all four corners of the Mizbeach. That's talking about an outer chatos. The keren dromis mizrachis bechlal, that would include the southeastern corner where there is no yesod. Again, the whole point is that we're suggesting the pasuk means to apply the blood only in the areas of the Mizbeach where there is a yesod. The area where there's no yesod is the dromis mizrachis, the southeastern corner. But that wouldn't apply to all bloods, because clearly the carbon chatas is applied to all corners, even the southeastern corner. So in other words, the point is, if you're going to learn the pasuk in this manner, that it's talking about the applications of the blood, it can only be referring to carbon. It can't be referring to all carbonos on the outer Mizbeach. And if that's true, el yesod ha'ola, it should have just said el yesod ha'ola, shetei ha'ola keneged ha'yesod mizbach ha'ola mayi. It should have simply said by carbon it has to be corresponding to the yesod. Mizbach ha'ola implies everything that is brought in, it's the outer Mizbeach. The Mizbeach ha'ola is the Mizbeach where the ola is brought. It's identifying the Mizbeach, and it would be referring to, again, all of the blood, but that can't be the case if we're talking about the applications. That's why the Gemara is asking that it should have just said el yesod ha'ola and not said mizbach ha'ola. And the Gemara continues and says, "Yihav ksiv el yesod ha'ola." Had the pasuk written el yesod ha'ola, so then havamina, then one might have thought it means as a kifa di yesod, that it's talking about the upright part of the base, meaning one could have interpreted it as saying that when it comes to a carbonola, the blood is applied to the actual sides of the base of the Mizbeach. That's how it might have been interpreted. And so therefore, hashta now dechsiv el yesod mizbach ha'ola, when it says el yesod mizbach ha'ola, again, it is talking about the applications of the blood, talking specifically about the applications of the blood of the carbonola, but by saying mizbach ha'ola, it means agago di yesod, it means that the blood is going to run onto the roof, onto the top of the base. The idea is, again, that the blood will be applied to the walls of the Mizbeach above the yesod, and the blood will drip down, will run down to the top of the yesod. That's why it would say mizbach ha'ola. And so again, one might have thought maybe that's what the pasuk is coming to teach us. It's talking about the applications of the blood, and again the Brisa goes on to say those can be learned through a kal v'chomer. And Rashi explains bizikifa di yesod sheyizrok tchilas matanos ha'ola ba'aliyas ama. One would think that you're going to apply the blood of a carbonola by the area where that ama that goes up shemin haaretz ad hachnisa shichonas ama, from the earth to the top of the yesod, where it already starts to go in. The yesod is like an edge, it goes in, so it comes up from the ground 1 amma, and then it goes in 1 amma to the Mizbeach. So one would think that wall, that area that's upright, that's the area where you apply the blood. To kulahu amma bein begova bein beknisa, that entire amma, whether in terms of height or whether in terms of width, yesod mikriya, that's called the base of the Mizbeach. And so one would have thought you apply the blood to the side of the base of the Mizbeach. But hashda dechsiv el yesod ha-Mizbeach, now that it says the yesod ha-Mizbeach, that means yesod shu doma le-Mizbeach. That means the yesod that is similar to an altar, dahainu gag shel yesod. That refers to the roof of the base, just like a Mizbeach, an altar, it's on the top that you sacrifice. So too here we're talking about the roof of the yesod. Again, that's the idea that you would apply the blood. Maybe the pasuk is teaching us to apply the blood to the areas of the Mizbeach where there's a yesod beneath. And the Gemara continues and quotes the parts of the Brisa with the Kal V'chomers of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yishmael says, Gag Yisod, if it's teaching us Gag Yisod, again, if the point of this pasuk is to teach us that by the applications of the blood of the carbonola, the blood is applied corresponding to the areas of the Mizbeach where there's a Yisod beneath, so then Lama Likra, that you wouldn't even need a pasuk for. Because Kal V'chomer, who that we could just make the following Kal V'chomer, Umashi Yore Chatos, if the remainder of the blood of the carbon Chatos, She'ena Mechaperes, that remainder is not an atonement to una gag yesod, that does require the roof of the base. So tchilas ola, the beginning, the applications of the blood of carbonola shemechaperes, which are for an atonement, einodin shetuna gag yesod. Isn't it logical to say that it requires the gag yesod? And Rabbi Akiva says along the same lines the following kal v'chomer: umashi yorechatos shein mechaprin vein boin lechaper. If the remainder of the carbon chatos, it's not a kapara, it's not coming to be a kapara to una gag yesod, that requires the roof of the yesod, the roof of the base. So tchilas ola, the initial applications of the blood of the carbonola, shemechaperes, which are an atonement, uva lechaper, and come as an atonement, eino din shetuuna gag yesod. Isn't it logical to say that it requires the roof of the base? And so therefore that's why it's clear. Imkain, if so, Matam Adlomer Yisod Mizbach Ha'ola. What does the pasuk mean when it says Yisod Mizbach Ha'ola? It means, as we said in the Brisa, Tain Yisod LeMizbeach Shalola. It means give a base to the Mizbeach Shalola, again, which means anytime there is blood applied to the outer Mizbeach, the remainder of that blood is poured to the base of the outer Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues and asks, "My beinayu, what's the difference between them?" Meaning, what's the difference between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva? Again, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, they both make this kal v'chomer, and the result of the kal v'chomer is to say that tchilas ola, that the applications of blood by the ola is te'una gag yisod, requires that it be applied to the mizbeach above the area of the mizbeach where there is a yisod. Again, talking about the applications of the blood. But the difference in the language between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Yishmael says the kal v'chomer by saying shiyarei chatos is eina mechaperes, whereas ola is mechaperes, and Rabbi Akiva says shiyarei chatos is ein mechapern ve'ein boin lechaper. Again, whereas tchilas ola is mechaperes uba lechaper. And so the Gemara is asking, what's the difference between those two formulations? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Ravada Barava, Ravada Barava says, Shirayim ma'akvim ika beinayu. The difference between them is whether shirayim, the remainder, is ma'akev, is it required or not? Mar savar ma'akvi, umar savar lo ma'akvi. One says they are required, and one says they are not required. And Rashi explains, Shirayim ma'akven ika beinayu. Rabbi Yishmael savar, Rabbi Yishmael holds, kaporo hu delo mechapri, that when it comes to the shirayim, that's again the pouring of the blood to the base of the mizbeach, so it's not for an atonement. Avoli kuve ma'akvi, but it is required. That's what Rabbi Yishmael says. Rabbi Akiva demosif ve'ein boin lechapara, but Rabbi Akiva, who adds on the phrase, they don't come as an atonement. Ashmeinon, that comes to teach us de'ein matan domim shal matanos taloi bahen, that the applications of the blood is not dependent upon that. It's not dependent upon the shirayim. Delo ma'akvi lehu shirayim lahazos. The shirayim are not something that are required as far as the hazos, as far as the sprinklings, the applications of the blood are concerned. And the Gemara continues, Rapapa, Amar Rapapa says, the Kuli Alma, everybody actually agrees, Shirayim ein ma'akvim, that the Shirayim, again pouring the remainder of the blood, is not ma'akev, meaning even Rabbi Yishmael would agree to that idea that the Shirayim are not ma'akev. V'hachen over here, what is the machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva? B'mitzoi chatas ha'of ma'akev kamiflagi, they're arguing about the squeezing by the chatas ha'of, it's the squeezing of the blood, that's what they are arguing about. Mar savar ma'akev, one says that is required, Umar savar lo me'akev, and the other one holds it is not required. And Rashi explains, the kuli alma shirayim lo ma'akvi, everybody agrees the shirayim are not ma'akev. Bechatos, we're talking about by the carbon chatos, va'afilu panimios, even the inner ones. V'hanoch shirayim de iflug behu Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Akiva. And when we're talking about a machlokas Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva by shirayim, by the remainder, that's talking b'mitzvoi chatos ha'of, that's talking by the squeezing of the blood, by the chatos ha'of, shehu shiyore haza'aso. That is the remainder of its sprinkling. By the bird offerings, what they would do is, they would sprinkle or apply the blood directly from the bird itself. The Kohen would wave his hands up and down with the bird, and that would be the application, and that way squeeze the blood out of the bird to apply that blood to the Mizbeach, and then there would be the mitzvah. The mitzvah was just the remainder of the blood that was in the bird. Again, it says in the pasuk, it's written, V'hiza midam hachatos al kir hamizbeach. It says first you sprinkle from the blood of the chatos, the bird chatos on the wall of the Mizbeach, v'hanishar badam, and then whatever blood is remaining, that goes to the base of the Mizbeach. So we're talking specifically about a bird carbon chatos, and again, Rabbi Yishmael would say that in that situation, it is ma'akev by the bird chatos, but Rabbi Akiva would say, it is not ma'akev. And the Gemara continues, Tanya kavasi de Rapapa, we have a brisa that supports Rapapa. And Rashi explains, Tanya kavasi de Rapapa, we have a brisa that supports Rapapa. The Islay Rabbi Yishmael Nami, that according to Rapapa, Rabbi Yishmael also agrees that lo ma'akvi shirayim, that the pouring of the remainder of the blood to the base of the Mizbeach is not a requirement. And the Brisa says, the Brisa brings a pasuk by the power Kohen Mashiach, by the power of the Kohen Gadol. It says, "V'as called dam hapar yishboch." It says all of the blood of the bull is poured. Matam and lomer hapar. Why does it have to say the word hapar over here? Limed al par Yom HaKippurim. It's talking about a different par. It teaches us about the bull of Yom Kippur. Sheton matan damim liyasod, that there's a requirement of an application of the blood to the yasod of the Mizbeach, to the base of the Mizbeach. Divrei Rebbe. These are the words of Rebbe. Some have Divrei Rabbi Akiva, some have Divrei Rabbi Yishmael over here. In any case, it teaches us about the Par Yom HaKippurim, that there's a requirement to pour the blood to the base of the Mizbeach. Amar Rabbi Yishmael says we don't need a pasuk for that, because kal v'chomer, we can make the following kal v'chomer. If you have a case where the blood, it's not a requirement to bring the blood inside, but ton yisod, but there's a requirement to pour the blood to the base of the mizbeach, that's referring to the par of the Kohen Gadol. So misha nichnas damo lifnim chova, so when it comes to the par Yom HaKippurim, where there's an obligation to bring the blood inside the hechel, so in such a case, Eino din shaton yisod, isn't it logical to say that there would be a requirement of, again, pouring the remainder of the blood to the base of the mizbeach, so we can learn from a kal v'chomer. Amar Rabbi Akiva says a slightly different formulation of the kal v'chomer. Umami she'ein damo nichnas lifnai v'lifnim. If when you're talking about a carbon where you don't bring the blood lifnai v'lifnim to the kodesh kadashim, bein l'chova, bein l'mitzvah, whether as an obligation, whether as a mitzvah l'chatchila, let's say, for example, again, the power of the Kohen Gadol, but ton yisod, but again, there's a requirement to pour the blood to the base of the mizbeach. So misha nichnas damo chova lifnai v'lifnim, you have a case like the par Yom HaKippurim where the blood is even brought lifnai v'lifnim, Eino din shaton yisod, isn't it logical to say there's a requirement to pour the blood to the base of the mizbeach? And the key part of the brisa is right here, Yochol Yaakvenu. Now this shirayim to the base of the mizbeach, one might think is a requirement, is ma'akev. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, V'chila mechaper sakodesh, it says he finishes from atoning, Sholmu kol hakaporos kulan, everything is complete with the atonements. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, these are the words of Rabbi Yishmael, that shows that it is not a requirement. And the brisa continues, kal v'chomer lepar kohen Mashiach me'at. We can now make a kal v'chomer by the power of the Kohen Gadol. We were talking about the par Yom HaKippurim, but we can make a kal v'chomer for the power of the Kohen Gadol. Umami she'ein nichnas damo lifnim lo chova v'lo mitzvah. When you have cases of karbonos where the blood is not brought into the Beis HaMikdash at all, not as an obligation, not as a mitzvah l'chatchila, ton yisod, but there is a requirement to pour the remainder of the blood to the base of the mizbeach. So misha nichnas damo lifnim bein l'chova bein l'mitzvah. When you have the blood of the par kohen Mashiach, where you are bringing the blood inside, whether as an obligation, whether as a mitzvah, Eino din shaton yisod. Isn't it logical? We should understand logically that it requires the blood to be poured to the base of the mizbeach. Yochol Yaakvenu. Now one might think this is a requirement. Again, Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, "V'yas kol dam hapar yishboch." Its phrase is that all of the blood of the par of the bull is poured, and nitko hakosov liaseh. What that means is the pasuk attaches it to an aseh, v'aso shiyore mitzvah, and makes it like the remainder of a mitzvah. Lomar loch, to say to you, to tell you, shirayim ein ma'achvin, that the remainder of the blood being poured to the base of the mizbeach is not required. And so you see clearly Rabbi Yishmael agrees it's not ma'akev, the shirayim to the base of the mizbeach. And Rashi explains, "V'as kol dam hapar b'kohen Mashiach ksiv." Again, the pasuk is written by the power of the Kohen Gadol. "V'as kol hadam yishbo chayayachol lechtov." It could have just said without the word hapar. Ma Talmud Lomer hapar. Why does it say hapar? Amar Rabbi Yishmael. Then Rabbi Yishmael brings this kal v'chomer. Lo lach lo kuba. He's not arguing. Elo lolamed she'in shirayim ma'akvin. But what he's really coming to teach is that the remainder of the blood pouring to the base of the mizbeach is not required. V'hachi kamer. And this is what he's saying. Par Yom HaKippurim mikal v'chomer huba. As far as the Par Yom HaKippurim, we have a kal v'chomer. The kasvu akosov, and yet the pasuk writes it. Yachol la'akev kasvulach. One might think it was written to be a requirement. Talmud Lomer v'chila mechaper. That's what the brisa says. No, it says in the pasuk v'chila mechaper. Maskana de milsid Rabbi Yishmael Asi. That's the concluding words of Rabbi Yishmael that it's not ma'akev. Misha'ein nichnas damo lifnim chova. The brisa says if it's a carbon where you don't bring the blood inside the Beis HaMikdash as an obligation, could go in par kohen Mashiach, like for example, the par of the Kohen Gadol, sheknisas damo lifnim eina chova kavua. Even though you do bring the blood inside the Beis HaMikdash, it's not a fixed obligation. Shalohi a mitzvah lachto lahavi chatos. Which what that means is it's not a mitzvah to sin and then to bring this carbon for the sin. That's what the Gemara means. It's not a chova. Ton yisod, it requires shvichas shirayim. You have to pour the remainder of the blood to the base of the mizbeach. So misha nichnas damo lifnim chova. When you have a case where the blood has to be brought inside, par Yom HaKippurim shu chova kavua b'chol shana. When it comes to the par Yom HaKippurim, that's an obligation every year. Rabbi Akiva bala hosav al devarav, and Rabbi Akiva is coming to add on to Rabbi Yishmael. Ad sha'ata lomdo mehechol shedam par nichnas lo mitzvah. Instead of learning it from the bringing inside the heichol, where the dam of the par is a mitzvah to bring in, say v'lomdo mi lefnai v'lefnim. You can have the limit instead from lefnai v'lefnim, from the kodesh kadashim obligation. She'eno nichnas lo chova v'lo lemitzvah, because again, outside of the par Yom HaKippurim, you don't bring into the kodesh kadashim, not as an obligation or a mitzvah. V'zen nichnas lo afil lechova. And here by the par Yom Kippurim, it's an obligation to bring it lifnai v'lifnim. Yochel Yakavenu, one might think the pouring of the Shirayim to the base of the Mizbeach is a requirement, and a Havikimi, Shashana Olav Hakos of La'akev, it's like the Torah repeated it as a requirement. Sharelo Hutzrach Lichtov V'chasva, wasn't needed to be written, but it was written. Talmud Lomer, B'Achrei Mos, the Pasuk says in Achrei Mos, V'chila Michaper, Shalmu Kol HaKaporos Kulan Ba'avodos Halolu Ho'amuros Be'inyan. Once you do the avodos that are mentioned, it's complete. Ushvicha Shirayim Lo Nem Rusham, the pouring of the Shirayim isn't mentioned over there, that's not a requirement. And then Kal V'chomer L'Par Kohen Mashiach Me'ata, the Brisa said, we have a Kal V'chomer to the part of the Kohen Gadol. Me'achar Shabanu L'chlal Kal V'chomer, once we're making Kal V'chomers, Yesh Lanu Lidrosh Kal V'chomer Kayotze Bo, we can make a similar Kal V'chomer, V'lomer Shashirayim Ma'akvin B'Par Kohen Mashiach, and we can say that Shirayim are required by the part of the Kohen Gadol. May Riboy HaKosef, from the inclusion of the Pasuk, Sharei B'Kal V'chomer, Hayolomid L'Shvicha Shirayim Misir Nasi, because you could learn the idea of pouring the Shirayim as from a Kal V'chomer, from the Seir, from the Higot of the king. So Yochel Yakvenu Me'ata, maybe one might think therefore it's in the Pasuk, it's a requirement. Talmud Lomer V'chila, the Pasuk says V'chila, it's not a requirement. And Rashi continues, Umami she'ein nichnas damu lifnim, if you have a carbon where the blood is not brought inside, could go in Seir Nasi V'chatas Yachid, like the Seir of the king, like the Chatas Yachid, the Chatas of an individual, she'ein nichnasim lahechel lo chova v'lo mitzvah, they're not brought into the Heichel for an obligation or for a mitzvah. Tu'un and Yesod, they require the Yesod. Par Kohen Mashiach she'nichnas damu lifnim mitzvah, by the power of the Kohen Gadol, which it's a mitzvah to bring the blood inside, Eino din shaton Yesod. Isn't it logical that it should require the Yesod? And again, Yochel Yakvenu Me'ata Denahave Kamisha Shon Olav La'akev, one might think it's required, because again, it's as if the Pasuk repeated it. Talmud Lomar V'yas Kol Dam HaPor Nitko HaKosov. The Brisa finished off that Nitko HaKosov Li'asei V'aso Shiyore Mitzvah, to say that Shirayim Ein Ma'akvin. Miseder Sharho Avodos, it uproots it, it disconnects it from the other Avodos. That's the point over here. The way that the Pasuk is phrased, V'yas Kol Dam HaPor Yishboch, so you're now taking that part of the Pasuk, the end of the Pasuk, talking about the pouring of the Shirayim, it's like separated from the rest of the Avodos. Vaso Shiyari Mitzvah, and therefore it's almost rendering it like extra from the Mitzvah. It's a remainder, a leftover. Shoshana Behilach Lashona, because Shoshana Behilach Lashona, because the way it's phrased is different. Shakola Avodos Ksiv, because by all other Avodos is written Velakach, Vehiza, Vinasan Al Karnos, it says he takes, he sprinkles, he applies, etc. Vekan Lochsiv Veshafach Damo Al Yisod. Here, it doesn't say what it would have normally said in the same phrasing. V'shafach, it says Ves Kol Dam HaPor Yishboch Elashana b'mashmo lenatko Michlal Shvar Avodos. The reason why it's changing the way it's normally formulated is to say this is different than other Avodos. Lomar she'eina chova k'mosim lakev. It's trying to say it's not an obligation like the others. And the Gemara continues, V'savar Rabbi Yishmael, does Rabbi Yishmael really hold mitzvah chatas ha'of ma'akev, that the squeezing of the remainder of the blood by the chatas ha'of is ma'akev, by the bird chatas is required? V'hatana devei Rabbi Yishmael, but it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael. It says in the pasuk, V'hanishar badam yimotze, what remains in the blood is squeezed. V'hanishar yimotze, what remains is squeezed, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis.